Thanks very much. Robin set the scene nicely, if you like. He's raised a number of issues that I want to talk about. And really what I want to do is give you a sort of a different perspective. You know, you're coming around very much as a food outlet from a, if you like, the science perspective and what we need to do to produce potatoes for the industry. Now, you know, what do people want? They want a good taste, they want a good texture, and they also want to see, you know, those healthy potatoes, you know, giving the vitamins, the fibre, the minerals that you know are also good in potatoes. But as well as that, as Rob said, you know, the farmers have got to be able to produce these commercially. They've got to be at a price that the consumers are prepared to pay, and you know, there is a real concern about producing them sustainably, so that environmentally sustainable production is important to the industry. And really, you've got to look at the genetics, the different varieties of the potatoes that you've got, and the environment that they're produced in. You know, Robin's talked very much about the environment up in Lancashire and where he grows potatoes, but around the country you've got a whole range of different production areas. And the agronomy at the different sites will vary. You know, we've got something like over 100 varieties being grown commercially in the UK that you potentially see on supermarket shops. And then you've got the management in the field and you've got the management in the store. So the two components Rob's already picked up on that that are affected are really the dry matter content. And when I'm talking about dry matter content, there's really two components to that. There's a starch within the potato itself, and then there's the cells of the potato that hold the starch in. So the dry matter, when you talk about dry matter, is made of two components. The cell walls, the bigger the potato, and then all the different starch grains that are in the potato. And the sugar levels. Certainly the sugar levels do vary, and it's both the sucrose that's important and the reducing sugars. So there's quite a lot of different sugars in the potato. The sucrose is important when you're sort of boiling potatoes. That gives you a sweet flavour, and the reducing sugars are important from the other side of it when you're frying for chip shops. And those are the sugars that are important when you're looking at fries, crisps, chips. So every component of the potato is contributing in a different way to the cooking quality of the potato. So you're seeing potatoes that have been grown, the varieties will affect the size of the potato, how large they are, how they're delivered. That's a sort of shop that's still fairly typical in a large bulk store. 1,000 1-ton boxes typically held in the stores. And when you're growing potatoes, the production and storage kind of affected quite markedly. Robin mentioned the soils he's growing on in Lancashire. Other soils, his will have very high levels of nitrogen, for example, in the soils. But other farmers have to add nitrogen fertilizer to make sure that they have the crop and it's growing. And the nitrogen will affect how the crop performs, how well it grows, how long it grows for in the season. So that will affect how large the tubers grow, how much starch comes into the potato, and then that will be affecting the cooking quality and the suitability for different processing purposes. About half the crop is irrigated nationally. We use a lot of water, and again, when you see irrigators, they're applying perhaps an inch of water on the whole field for a period of time, over a period of time. But that has to be very carefully managed so that you're getting that water applied very uniformly over the field. Again, if you're not doing this precisely, you get differences in the water content of the soil, and that affects again how the potatoes grow, how much starch is there, and the quality of it. So, precision is important in farming businesses to ensure consistent quality. Show a picture of a box store. That's the other way potatoes are stored. Large bulk piles, typically 1,000 tons in a large bulk pile. The potatoes that are often stored for the processing industry that go for crisps or chips are quite often stored in bulk piles. And this is the effect of different temperatures. If you are storing at quite a high temperature in the stores, you take them out and you get a very light crisp or fry or chip. If that temperature drops down, you'll get a much darker fry from exactly the same potatoes that you put in. So that's the size of difference that you can get just by the holding temperature in the stove. Now, I've mentioned the dry matter content, and really the way that that's most often interpreted is the terms waxy and floury. That's used by the industry, it's used by the processing companies, it's used by the packers quite and it does relate to this dry matter content. So the waxy end of the scale would traditionally be low dry matter, and the floury end would be the high dry matter. But that's not the whole story, because as I said earlier on, the dry matter is made of different components. There's a starch, there's a cell walls, and that waxy to floury isn't really much use for consumers. You've got to have a different vocabulary to help the consumers understand what they're getting in terms of the quality they can expect from the potatoes. Now, these are some pictures of potatoes and potato cells. This one on the top is a raw potato that's just been sliced, and it's a scanning electron microscope picture. And you can see the cell walls, the angular cell walls, and the starch grains in the cell. And if you pull this starch grains out again, that starch is made up of granules that sit inside the cells. Two different components make up the starch, and depending on the balance of the different components of starch, you get different textures and different characteristics of the potatoes when they're cooked. The two bottom pictures show what happens when potatoes is cooked. This is one that's a baked potato, so the potato's been baked, the water has been driven off from the outside of the potato, and you get that crisp outside, and then the potatoes cells are packing closer together, and that's when the baked potato's been sheared apart, and you've got quite a uniform face of cells, and that will be reflected in the texture, the bite, when you taste that baked potato. And this is a boiled potato, very, very different. That's and what you can see there is the cells have rounded off, the starch grains have swollen, they've absorbed water, they've gelatinized, and the starch within the potato cells has swollen. And what's actually happened in this particular variety, you've had swelling pressure of the different cells, and the cells are pushed apart. So that will give you a very, very mealy mouthfeel. And in part that's depending on how well the cells go together. You can imagine sort of a bin bag full of balloons, and as those balloons increase, the bin bag will increase in size, the cells will start sizing up. Some of them may burst because they've broken too much, and you'll get quite a mix of different cell sizes. If the cells burst, they release the starch grains into, and that gives you a very, very different mouthfeel. So there's a lot going on when you're cooking potatoes, and the interplay between the starch, the types of starch, the cells and the cell walls all contribute to the flavour of the potato, or the texture of the potato, I should say. So really, when you start looking at potatoes, you get a range of the varieties down there, give you a range of different characteristics, different mouthfeels, and the ones that are smooth, or described as smooth, desiree, very popular red variety that you'll see. The potatoes hold their shape generally. You do get some slipping on the surface as the potatoes cook and the cells start to break away. And if you mash them down with a fork, you start getting those cells separated. But you get quite a smooth texture to that mash. And if you try and just break it, what happens is the potatoes tend to break apart in large units. And that's actually the potato that you saw through the scanning electron microscope for the baked potato, where you had a clean split and you saw that sort of shear surface on the potatoes. King Edward, fluffy, great for roasting, because when cooking you You get perhaps a bit more sloughing on the surface. That can pick up the fat, it absorbs the fat at high temperatures. That will crisp up and make a lovely crisp outside. And it's got that much more flowery middle to the variety. And when you break it down, it doesn't break as cleanly. You get much more. The potato will break up into several pieces. And the final type that you can readily see is salad potatoes. These have a much firmer texture, much firmer bite. You don't get that sloughing on the surface of the potatoes. When you mash them down with a fork, they don't mash down as strongly. And if you try and break them apart, you put a pen in, it's very firm. You won't get the potato breaking. So you can see there's very, very different characteristics between the different varieties, and that's just showing typically what happens when you see these different types of potatoes moving together. So that's texture. It's really part driven by the starch, the cell size, and that's affected by how the potatoes are grown. The aroma and flavour is a much more difficult characteristic to get a grip on and understand. Potato Castle from the work at Reading University Institute of Food Research, Chip in Camden, to try and get some handles on what's going on in terms of the aroma, around the potatoes. And this is some of the experiments we've done. Boiling up the potatoes, putting them in the jars, and allowing the volatiles to come off from the cooked potatoes. Stand here, you can smell a whole range of aromas coming from the cooked potatoes. Well, that's done exactly the same way in a lab, cooking up the potatoes, and then what happens with the aromas? They're collected, and you can run them through a machine, and you can identify all the different compounds that come off the potatoes as they've been cooked, whether they're boiled or baked, and you can identify the different chemicals that are released. Same as starch content, same as texture, you get marked differences in the volatiles that are released from the potato. Anya is a variety that has a very distinctive, nutty type of aroma. This one down here is a test variety. It's related to varieties such as Maine Gold that it's marketed, and that's got a very earthy type of flavour. And Morris Piper is a benchmark variety. And you can see, if you look down, you have differences in these peaks. The intensity of the different peaks give you different intensities of flavour. So you're perhaps able to characterise the varieties by their different profiles. It's a long way to go, but perhaps at some point in time, somebody will be able to say, yeah, that's a Morris Piper that's grown up in the Lancashire, and great for chipping, and then this is another one that's giving off the aroma of volatiles from some crop that's growing in Cambridgeshire. That'll be good for going into the processing factory down at the Keynes or the like. So long way to go, but the building blocks are there to get that better understanding of aroma. So the varieties are different in terms of aroma. I have to say, it is the sugar components that are contributing, and the amino acid precursors. Potatoes are a good source of amino acids, and it's how those cook up is important. If you think about it, potatoes aren't designed, or didn't really evolve to be. They evolved to be a storage organ for the crop to see it through to the next storage season. So you've got to be cooking potatoes to release the taste and the aroma compounds from the juice. Very different to fruits, strawberries. and the like, where they are designed to attract something that will eat them and pass the seeds on. So two very different scenarios with potatoes, really needing to be cooked, and those growing conditions and different components contributed to the flavour and aroma of the potatoes. And we've been able to identify this methanol as one compound that is particularly characteristic of a potato flavour. So that's one of the challenges with potato processing, is that levels of methanol are reduced, so you don't get a strong potatoey flavour. When you're talking to consumers, they'll pick up on potatoiness. Perhaps, look in the future, is there some way we can manage the crop so that we have high levels of the precursors that create methanol in the future? So, you can produce potatoes with a better potatoey flavour. So, it's those precursors, where you're growing the crop, the storage time, all influence the flavour of the potatoes. And this is going back to the potato flavour and the importance of value. So, really, where's this taking us? We know something about the texture of potatoes being driven by the dry matter content. We know something about the flavour compounds that contribute to flavour. But potato breeding is a very timely process. And from an initial crops in a glass house, producing the potato berries that have the seeds in, planting those out in glass houses, and then getting them to field trials. Typically, it would take between 7 years to 10 years to get it from the initial cross through to getting a variety that may be commercially successful. So it's a very time-consuming process, and out of all of those varieties, all the seeds in there, one of them may make a commercially successful variety. So it's a numbers game, and anything we can do to improve that numbers game will help. And there's some characteristics we can breed for. Ones at this end, white flesh, yellow flesh, they're easy to do. Anything above that 0.5, you stand a good chance in understanding the genetics of the potato you can breed for. So white and yellow flesh, fairly straightforward. But once you get onto these characteristics, the odour characteristics, the intensity of flavour, whether it tastes earthy, whether there's a salty or metallic taste, all of those characteristics are very, very difficult to understand genetically and breed for. And at this end, the floury, the moist, again, coming back to those dry matter contents, those can be bred for. So it's how do we move forward in those difficult areas. And one way that we might be able to do it is use genetic maps. In the same ways that the human genome has been sequenced, the potato genome has been sequenced. And if we can identify markers in the same way as you hear medical people talking about markers for particular diseases, you might be able to develop markers for particular traits in potatoes. And rather than going through all of these generations, perhaps over 10 years, if you can identify the marker in your parent generations, it's on the gene map, you can improve your breeding efficiency by choosing the parents of the two types of characteristics you want, and it reduces the numbers game and it can speed up the breeding of varieties. So lots of new technologies coming along in the future that can help us, and that is really important because varieties is the dominant characteristic that affects texture and flavour, and we'll see that later on this evening. And the production, what farms can do, can manipulate that to give you the precise dry matter content, precise sugar content for the different uses. So, let's say, potato producing and getting it to the consumers is a real balancing act. there's a consumer's expectations in what they want to have from their potatoes on the plate. You're looking for consistency year in, year out. You're looking for consistency between the different varieties. And you've heard how difficult it is, from Robin growing year on year and all the different factors that can affect the characteristics of the potato. And it's really reducing this variability that we need to reduce, and that will help the consumer a lot if there's a vocabulary that they can understand and know what they're going to get from the potatoes that are offered. So a very quick run through potato production, breeding, genetics, but I hope that I've explained some of the intricacies behind what the industry has to go to put a potato on the plate.
Questions later or
whenever. I'm just watching my time.
Okay. I guess we could have 5 minutes questions if there's anyone that has asked a question right now. I don't know what's for breeding potatoes or
No. If you get a successful variety, and they worth tens of billions. So a lot of businesses are breeding varieties. All over the globe. In the UK, there's about 4 potato breeding businesses that are breeding for varieties. But those businesses are working on behalf of several companies. So the likes of Canes, the PepsiCos, the Greenbird, they're all looking at getting particular varieties that suit their end market needs. So McCain's will be looking for the large, long potatoes that are used for producing French fries. PepsiCos will be looking for the smaller, rounder ones that will crisp, and they've got the right amount of protection for crisping. And the companies that are supplying the retailers will be looking for the varieties with a whole range of different characteristics. All of those breeding programs are going on at the moment. There's a lot of varieties coming through the sea, and a lot of them have quite distinctive characteristics. But as you said, there's a real challenge, because not only are the breeders looking to produce the culinary characteristics, they've got to deal with all the other characteristics that the potatoes have got to yield satisfactorily, and they've got to have the disease resistance as they allow the growers to produce them successfully.
Are any of them doing it for flavour?
Yeah.
Even with
Oh yes, yeah. The flavour ones are coming through. There's I talked about crossing different parents in breeding programs. What you can do, and what some companies have done, is going back to wild species of potatoes, the types of potatoes that are used in the Andes, for example, and they've crossed those with conventional potatoes. And some of the varieties that are coming through, they're called Foreca type varieties, and they have got a very distinctive and characteristic flavour, and they actually, because of the starch, the type of starches in those, have a shorter cooking time than the traditional varieties. They've got a very distinctive flavour, and perhaps as well as using them as standard culinary potatoes, because of the flavour, it could be used as additives in recipes to bring out potato flavour in recipes. So there's several different ways that people are looking at different flavour characteristics.
Roosters suddenly seem to burst upon us from nowhere into instant popularity.
Yeah.
Are they a British potato?
Rooster is an Irish bred variety. You might have heard of a variety called Cara before. It's coming from the same breeder that was producing Rooster, and that's it. And that has been bred through a conventional route. and that has been very successful because it has got very good cooking qualities. It is suitable for a wide range of purposes, and it has been marketed very strongly. It's got a very distinctive brand behind it, and the business that's marketing that. So and I think its success is in part because it can be used for a wide range of purposes.
One more question. So, theoretically, could you breed low carbohydrate potatoes?
A low carbohydrate potato would be
Or are all potatoes the same? Actually?
no, they will be different.
Yeah.
A low carbohydrate potato is basically a potato with a lower dry matter content, a lower starch content. So, early potatoes would be a low dry matter content, and you see claims about low GI potatoes. By and large, if you go back and look at those are the potatoes that have the lower dry matter content, and that's all there is to it.
Right.
An early harvested or potato that hasn't built up its full starch content, and some clever marketing.